All right, my fellow veterans, how y'all doing out there? Hopefully, you survived Veterans Day and all those special activities that were going on during the week. Man, it was busy up here in Cleveland. Got to go see the Cleveland Cavaliers uh, win, and got invited to a special banquet at John Carroll University. That was an amazing event. And but what's even more amazing is our guest tonight. Let me introduce to you retired Air Force Colonel Lisa Carrington Firmin. And from what I have been able to find in my research is the Colonel here is one of the leading voices on military sexual trauma. And not only is she the leading voice, but she's also an award-winning author, award-winning artist, and a Bronze Star uh, recipient as well. So thank you for coming on, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me here tonight. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate you coming on. This is extremely exciting for me because of the work that you're doing. I believe you are actually helping save lives. So to begin with, how what got you started in this with the military sexual trauma?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's interesting because I've been a pretty private person when it comes to that kind of stuff, and I didn't really talk about the realities of my own experiences when I first came in the military. I concentrated pretty hard on just climbing the ranks and being a commander. But it wasn't until 2020 when Vanessa Guillen was murdered at Fort Hood. She was a young Army specialist at Fort Hood, a Latina just like me. And so when I saw her picture, I saw my own at the same, almost younger than her, because I was sexually assaulted at initial training, and that was years ago, and I had never spoke about it. I mean, I think I call myself the queen of compartmentalization. I just kind of bury things and I press forward. But we all know, that that's not good.
Mhm.
You need to really process your experiences if you can, and if you can get the right help to do that. So I decided after her horrific murder, and it was during COVID, so we're all hunkered
Yes.
down, we're kind of isolated. So I said, okay, this is the time, I need to, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference, especially for someone who's never spoken up about this subject? And I said, well, her murder cannot go down in vain. I have to do something. And she inspired so many people to speak up, and myself included. So then I started writing my story, and I did that in an opinion piece. And I'm in Texas, and it was published by the San Antonio Express News, and it was called something like "Women Protecting Their Country, but the military doesn't protect them."
Mm.
And the first line was, I'm a combat vet, Bronze Star decorated. So why did I never report my own sexual assault? And then I start talking about that, and that just went everywhere. Military Times picked it up, and then it went on the internet, and then people started calling me, writing me, and telling me their stories. And then I realized, you know, I can do some good here. I can tell my story, but I can also interview other people and tell their stories. And I can really convey to the American public and to other veterans that this is a real issue, and it has been for years. So I decided to write a book. And the book was Stories from the Front, pain, betrayal, and resilience on the MST battlefield. So, and I selected 13 other people to join me on the journey. So it was 14 people that I wrote about, including myself. Um, and the book actually spans 50 years. There are two
Yes.
active duty people in the book, a sailor and an airman, and I don't reveal their identity because I wanted to protect their privacy. But everybody else, we went ahead and used their real name because they gave permission to do that. And the oldest person in the book was a WAC, a Women's Army Corps member from Vietnam. She
Oh
was a
man.
grunt in Vietnam. By the way, also garnered a Bronze Star years ago in combat. And then the youngest was a young Latina who was at Fort Hood, who is the creator of the hashtag I am Vanessa Gann.
Mm.
And I'm real proud of her because what happened, she had been sexually assaulted, harassed for quite some time at Fort Hood, right before Vanessa Guillen was. And I don't know if you recall Vanessa Guillen's story, but she went
Yes.
missing in April, wasn't found until June.
Right.
So her family hired attorneys, and then they really came up to the Army and said, we need to find her. Because initially the Army said, oh, she's probably just AWOL. I think that year they had 26 people that were either murdered, um, were killed or suicide. I mean, that's 26 people in 1 year, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so they found her remains, and so this young Latina, in between the time of April and June, she said they're not looking for her. So what can she do? She's still active duty. So she went online and she told her own story of sexual assault and harassment, and she signed it hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen. And
Mm.
that created a whole, avalanche of people speaking up, myself included. So I give her a lot of credit. She's a chapter 14 in my book, so I'm real proud of her
Hmm.
for standing up and speaking at being so young. I think she was 23 at the time, but she told her story. She's no longer in the army, but the retaliation she experienced was pretty horrific. So but she was
Yes.
bold enough to speak up, and unlike I was all those years ago, right?
But I know what it's like not to want to speak up, and then once you finally do, the it feels like a load comes off your back.
Oh yeah, that book, writing all those stories, interviewing all those people was very hard to write. I
Hmm.
say this in the afterword. I said this book was not a labor of love. No, it was a horrific deep dive into my past and to these other individuals' past, and it re-triggered the trauma I experienced. But I was determined to tell their stories and to honor them and respect them with how I share their stories. And one of my efforts, or one of my things I really wanted to do, was to indicate to the American public, especially, that this happens to anybody and everybody. I mean, you could be a
Hmm.
grandmother, you could be, a male. There's one male in the book. You could be a mother or not a mother. You could be an aunt, an uncle. It doesn't matter. And so the cover of that book is pictures of the people when they first came in the military, with the exception of the two active duty. That's a silhouette to show that I didn't reveal their identity. But I think that's important because I really wanted to convey the diversity of this issue. That it does
Right.
not discriminate. It does not discriminate. There's two LGBTQ people in the book as well. I really wanted to show that how deeply entrenched it has been in our military for so many years. And frankly, Tim, I wanted to make up for being silent for so many years myself.
Mm.
So I really pushed hard to get this book out in less than a year.
Wow, that went pretty quick.
Yeah, and I had a great publisher with me out of Seattle, Blue Ear Books. When I first
Hmm.
approached him on this book idea, he was all there for me and really encouraged me, but he didn't think I could do it in less than a year. Especially when you're interviewing other people. And I interviewed about
Yes.
15 people because I told stories in the book, but I also interviewed people who run advocacy groups, and I had some national information in there. And I also partnered with a psychologist at a university who wrote a chapter on treatment, because it's important to
Mm.
me to not just tell the stories, but to show, hey, okay, now I learned more about this, and maybe it happened to me. So what do I do now? Right. So here's
Hmm.
evidence-based therapies that are available for PTSD, for MST specifically. Um, and then here are national, regional, and state resources for you as well. So I think that's important. And then here's an advocacy group that I interviewed and wrote about. So I think that's important, that you just don't lay it on them and walk away.
Hmm.
Right.
Yes. And now you stated this was tough for you to write, and it brought back many memories. How were you able to cope with that?
Well, in 2020, late 2020, I finally decided, again, it was during the COVID time, and I finally decided it was time for me to face everything that I had experienced and to not diminish it or to not compartmentalize and move on, you know. And I'm a Latina too, so I had the double, if you want to call it, whammy of being a woman and being a Latina woman, with a
Hmm.
different ethnicity than the average that's in the military, right? So I was truly different, and I stuck out as unusual and different for a long time. So I didn't. I just wanted to be successful, right? So, but it was very difficult to write the book because it triggered. I wrote my story first because I said, I'm not going to interview people and write their story until I've gone through it and seen how hard it is. Because let me tell
Right.
you, I was a commander in the Sunni Triangle in Iraq. This was harder than that. I was trained to be a commander in the Sunni Triangle in Iraq. I was not trained to deal with trauma, and my own emotions. I was trained to bury that. That's a sign of weakness. And that's not right. But that's what I was taught. And a lot of people in the
Hmm.
military are taught that, especially those who are in leadership roles. So I had to work really hard to kind of let the facade fall away. and to really see the raw person who went through all the young lieutenant, actually officer trainee, who went through a lot of this, and then the young lieutenant who went through a lot of harassment, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I would write, Tim, I would write a couple lines of my story, and then I would be so enraged I'd just get up and walk away. Uh, I was just so upset. Um, I was incredulous at what I went through because I had buried so much of it. I had forgotten what I went through. So just to remember was difficult. But I can tell you honestly that what helped me was talking to the people I interviewed, sharing their story, knowing I was not alone with the feelings I had,
Mm.
right? They had the same feelings, different experiences, but a similar vein. So that was really good for me to learn that. So they became like a support group for me, right? And then I was actually doing EMDR therapy with the VA because I finally
Mm.
said, okay, I need to go ahead and face the demons from my past, both combat related and also military sexual trauma. So I did. But I was grateful for going through therapy at the time because there were days I'd come in and say, I don't want to do EMDR today. I just want you to tell me how you set boundaries and you don't absorb my trauma. How do you do that? Because I was
Right.
absorbing everybody's trauma. I call the people in my book my last command because I truly
Mm.
feel like their commander. I want to protect them. I want to help them. I don't want any more bad things to happen to them. I want to honor them. So and I wrote an article about that called "My Last Command" because I wanted to convey how I was feeling, right? And as
Mm-hmm.
a writer, I mean that's kind of what I do. I try I want you to know and understand and feel what I feel, and the only way I can do that is to write.
Man, yes. And that therapy that you went through the VA, I went through that same program, and it's an amazing program.
Yeah, it was really, and this is, I'm a person who never wanted to do that before, who said, oh, that's not going to help
Mm-hmm.
me, right? Uh,
Right.
but I found talking with other veterans, writing, getting stuff out, whether I published it or not, just getting it out, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
seeing it in black and white, and acknowledging the pain and what I went through. Um, yeah, and then doing the therapy all together. Those are what kind of saved me. I'm not sure I would have made it, Tim, writing this book without going through therapy at the same time, because I would have.
Right.
I call it the abyss, and I wrote a poem
Mm.
about it called the abyss, where I get stuck in this very dark, black pitch void that sucks me down. And when you think about trauma and pain, and I had to crawl my way out of the abyss. And I crawled my way out through the people I spoke with, my psychologist, the EMDR therapy, the writing, all that helped save my life. Otherwise, I would have been stuck in the abyss.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Um, Now you said you interviewed all these people. Did it take several days to interview each one, or some go quicker than others? Or
Yeah, some went quicker than others. They all didn't live near me. I'm in Texas. They weren't necessarily
mm-hmm.
in Texas. Some were. Some were in DC, Michigan, different places, North Carolina. So I had to do Zoom sessions or some kind of virtual media to platform to interview them and record the interview. Um, some people wanted to come to my house. The Vietnam vet, she said, I want to come. She lived like an hour away from me, an hour and a half.
Mm.
She said, I want to come to your house. I want to look you in the eye before I trust you to tell my story. And she told me when
Wow.
she came to visit with me, she wasn't sure she was going to tell me her story until she met me and realized that I was genuine. She kept saying, "But you're a colonel," and she kept saying, "But you're a colonel." Like she was a grunt, and back then,
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam era, she's like, "Colonels don't talk to grunts," you know what I mean? And
Right.
certainly don't respect them. And she said, you were disarming. When I came in, you were not the person I expected you know. So we hit it off. We become best friends, and I was honored to tell her story. And it was hard. Her story in particular took probably 3 or 4 sessions. And what's interesting, Tim, is that her story was the only story I wrote without any notes because I had got to know her so well, all the sessions we had. And I recorded the sessions, and I took notes, but I didn't need them. We had met so many times that I knew her story inside out. And
Mm.
I was able to write her story. And the book is chronological, like, with the exception of my story up front, because hey, author prerogative, I'm first. So
Yeah. Now, reading your book, I'm going to be honest to our audience. And by the way, for you, those of you that are watching, the chat is open. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them. Don't worry about that. We will. And the book, reading your book brought up so many emotions to me. And there was one story that really hit me hard, and that was your chapter 10 called Broken Trust. A young man by the name of Victor Gonzalez. What that man went through, it, it, no human being should go through.
Right. And he
Well,
had kept a lot of that in.
yeah.
You know,
I mean, none of
I
these
wrote about
women,
how I met him in the book, right? Because he was someone I
yes,
knew before. I mean, um, but I didn't know his story. I just knew this man had a chip on his shoulder. He was angry, but I didn't
yes.
know why he was angry. I mean, like when I wrote that book,
Mhm,
I was angry. I was really angry. And I've been able to work through my anger and my rage, but um, he was kind of still angry, but I didn't know why. And some of I met him at a university where I worked, and he he exhibits some behavior that are kind of associated with people who've gone through trauma, right?
mhm,
But I offered to mentor him in professional development, that kind of thing. Initially, he turned me down, and I wrote about this in the book because he came back to me a few months later and said, "Is that offer still open?" I said, "Of course it is." You know, so I kind of took him under my wing and started talking. But it wasn't until he learned that I was writing this book, and I asked him, "Would you be interested in sharing your story?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, you don't have to." You know, I mean, it's so sad for me to say this, but there's so many people out there who've experienced this and were willing to share their stories that I didn't have to pressure anybody at all. I mean, I could have written a book of 100 stories, which is so sad, you know. And I interviewed people I didn't tell their story because at the end of the day, they just could not go public. It is,
mm,
you give up your privacy completely when you go public with something like this, as traumatic as
yes.
this. So he wasn't sure, and I said, okay, it's okay. And then I remember him calling me back again another few months, and at that time I was talking to 3 different men because I wanted to include a man in the story, and I hadn't confirmed them yet, but we were talking, and he came back to me and said, I want to I want to do this. I trust you. And I said, okay, that's great. And so once I found out what he had gone through in his early childhood, he had been abused as a child. And then I found out what happened to him in active duty and what happened to him in college. And no wonder he was angry. I could
Yes.
understand why he was angry. So, like I said, the book was very therapeutic for all of us that participated because we learned we weren't alone and we were able to share. I've had several tell me, hey, when are we going to have a session where we all come together and meet for the first time?
Mm,
But again, we're all over the country. But maybe one day we should do that, right? Um,
yes.
but yeah, he's gone through a lot, and it's called broken trust for a reason. The broken trust from
Yes.
from family members, the broken trust because of the abuse he went through, the broken
Yes.
trust from the military, broken trust from people who abused him in college as well. And it's just he's gone through so much. It's just and people can relate to it. I was at an event once, and a gentleman bought the book from me, and he didn't talk to me though. He bought the book and then he moved on. And I heard from him later. He emailed me and said the first chapter I read was broken trust. And he said there were so much similarities between Victor's experience and mine. He says this is so important, that I know now I'm not alone. So
Hmm.
Victor coming forward as a man to tell a story, I think was really important. Um,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, it's inspiring to other people.
And then we do have a comment here that I'm going to post. It's from Harry Pez, and it's what an honor and responsibility to have that kind of trust. Now, he
Yeah,
posted this when you were talking about the lady from Vietnam. And
right. Oh,
so,
yes, it
yes,
was
that's,
it was an honor for me. And again, I really took this seriously to tell their stories in such a way that would humanize them and humanize this issue, personalize this issue. So that when people see examples of MST, now MST is the entire continuum of harm. I mean, from verbal
hmm,
harassment all the way to rape and murder and everything in between. Physical assault, verbal assault. I mean, you name it. It's everything. So the book has stories that go across the whole continuum of harm. And I never forget one person told me that when they read the book, she was a colonel at one of the academies, and when she read the book, she said, "That's my big takeaway. When I read your book, I walked away with saying some people on the continuum of harm, they may not have been physically assaulted, but they were chronically harassed from day one, and they internalized that harassment, and it created so much trauma for them. So
hmm,
and that's true. We all react differently, but the trust thing was a big deal for me. I wanted so to honor them because this is a very delicate subject, explosive subject.
Yes.
And I was not judgmental at all. I couldn't be, and I was like them, you know. So that was one thing they really appreciated, that there was no judgment. There was just, okay, this is the story, this is what happened. And then every once in a while I would say, that happened to me too. And then I would remember, oh yeah, I forgot about that, because I had buried it so deeply, I'd forgot about it. But there are so many similarities. But another thing I did is, when the book was ready to be published, I contacted everybody that I wrote about, and some of the people that were away, different states. I didn't email them. I was kind of paranoid about intellectual property at that time. So
Hmm.
I didn't email them my story. I said, we're going to go over it line by line with you and me on this Zoom session or whatever. And we're going to go over it. And there were times that we had to stop. We had to stop because
Hmm.
it was just too emotional for them. But they were grateful, and every one of them said that I truly honored and respected them. And like the Vietnam vet, when she read her story, she came to my house, and she couldn't get past the first page. She started crying, and I just left her alone. I let her alone to read the story, and I would come in every once in a while, just check on her, pat her on the back. But imagine going through trauma, especially her 50 years before, and never
Yes.
talking about it publicly, never really processing it publicly, I mean, personally processing it, um, and feeling still shame and guilt for what happened to her, as if she asked for this, right?
Right.
Um, so there's just so many feelings, that it's a very complex issue, right? But I was honored to tell those stories, each story, and I felt like I respected them in the way I did it, and they told me I did. And some authors, will interview and write your story, and you don't have a chance to look at it as detailed like I did. But I did make a couple of changes with someone said, hey, I really don't like the way that says or whatever. And I said, okay, I'm going to use my words, but if that bothers you, I will change that. First
Hmm.
I want to make sure it's factually correct, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's another chapter that was very moving to me too, but in a different way. I found this story to actually be inspirational, the way she told her story. And that was chapter 8, um, Actions Not Words, by K. Denise uh, Rucker Krepp, spelled
Yes.
Krepp.
Yeah, actions, not words, right?
Yes.
um, I was so proud of her because she had experienced retaliation throughout her career, um,
Hmm.
and both in the military. She was in the Coast Guard, both Coast Guard, and then also out of the Coast Guard as a civilian employee with the military. And I just thought it was important to tell her story, because she tried to to start, initiate investigations into these issues, because young people came to her and told her, and then she was shut down. So the investigation never took off. So,
Hmm.
and that's what's sad, because that happens a lot in different branches, and especially back then. Now, of course, with the laws that have changed, thank goodness, there's more accountability in the system built in, and there's more avenues for those survivors to move forward if they want to seek justice. Time will tell, though, because we're still initiating some of the changes through Department of Defense that the laws passed just recently, just a couple of years ago. So, but yeah, her story was, she wasn't afraid to speak up, but it cost her her job.
Hmm.
You know, and then she's still not afraid to speak up. She still speaks up today, and she has a great way with the words. She can write pretty well. So she writes opinion pieces, she writes articles, she does presentations. So she's one who took up the flag and said, I'm going to be in this space and I'm going to make a difference. So I'm real
Yep.
proud of her, what she's doing, because this is not an easy space to be in. It's very personal, um, and we do not want to come across. We are not whining. We're
Right.
not complaining. We are correcting the historical record with actual lived experiences and educating people so that they will be in a better position to make decisions when it comes to laws, policies, and programs.
The the very beginning of her chapter, it reads, "People are given a voice for a reason, and they need to use their voice so people can hear and learn about sexual assault and sexual harassment. It is important for passionate people to continue taking up this fight. Absent our voices, our noise, this just keeps occurring."
Right.
And
And that's what I did. Is every chapter I wrote their chapters in third person, right?
hmm.
Because I interviewed them and I wrote their story. But every beginning of every chapter, I used a quote from them that
Yes.
that they had given me, and that was a quote I started her chapter with, because again, when I interviewed her, I knew immediately I was going to say actions, not words. That was going to be the title of her chapter. I knew immediately because of how strong she is in that. And she's an individual who contacted me. And this is interesting too, how this works out. I created like a one-page abstract on the book, my book idea, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then I was going to send it out different places and say, hey, if you're interested in participating, contact me. I never did that. I never sent it anywhere. I didn't have to. People contacted me after that opinion piece I wrote.
Hmm.
And then she was one of the people, was a couple of them who heard about what I was going to do from somebody else. And then they contacted me. And one lady actually contacted me on LinkedIn. I
Oh
heard
wow.
what you're doing. I want to be part of what you're doing. How can I help? You know?
Oh man, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people did that. So it was amazing to me. Another thing that was sad to me though, was that people I knew, maybe colleagues I worked with, whether it was in higher education or in the military, that I had no idea that they had experienced this as well. Of course, they had no idea I did, but once I
Hmm.
kind of came out with my experience, they started contacting me. And then I learned, wow, people I knew, I had no idea the person sitting next to me had gone through what they went through. Right. So
Right.
truly, you don't know, Tim, the person right next to you, male or female, you have no idea what they've gone through. You don't know their journey,
Hmm.
you know?
Right.
So that really opened my eyes at how deeply entrenched this issue was.
Yeah, and take out the part about sexual assault and sexual harassment, and that quote can mean that can cover everything.
Sure. Sure.
Because one of the things I try to do on this podcast is to get other veterans involved in issues.
Right.
Tell them, hey, you got a voice. Speak up. If things aren't going right at the VA, speak up.
That's
If
right.
you don't like what's happening in your town, speak up.
That's right. That's exactly right. But it's hard to speak up. I mean,
Yes,
like I said,
it
you give
is.
up your privacy, and you become a target for some people who don't agree with what you're doing, you know?
Hmm.
But for me, I mean, part of it was I hadn't spoken up in years. I felt tremendous amount of guilt for that. And then I felt, well, this is the best way for me to speak up, right? And then I'm just really pleased to say that as I was writing the book, I said, wouldn't it be cool to take this book, the stories in it, create training materials to educate active duty people with lived experiences, right? Forget the
Yep.
PowerPoint stuff, training. I'm talking real
Yeah.
experiences. So that's what I did. I created case studies from some of the chapters in the book, and then I took them on the road, and I was hired by some bases to do that. So I think that's really cool because that's something that I had envisioned as I was writing the book, and then it actually happened.
Oh man, that's really good.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
like the highlight of my journey so far with this particular book, right? Um,
Hmm.
and then I've spoken at different conferences. They're starting to have more and more MST conferences across the country.
Yes.
So I'm starting to go to those and speak, and then share some of the stories in the book, and share why it is so, even though you're very vulnerable telling your story. You're very vulnerable sharing it publicly, but it's also very empowering because you own what happened to you and you're doing something with it, right?
Yes.
I'm not hiding in the corner anymore. I'm not, quiet anymore. And that's what I said when I published this first book. I said, silent no longer. It's not
Right.
going to happen. I'm going to speak up about, and when this first the book started, when I started writing the book, I was focusing on MST. But guess what I found? I found that a lot of people, especially African American, Latino, and women and LGBTQ people, experience so much discrimination for their race, ethnic, sexual identity, or orientation, rather. So I
Right.
ended up writing some of those stories in the book. And so, like for example, my story, I talk about ethnicity discrimination as a Latina, right? Some of the jokes that were really crude that I got when I first came in, and then of course discrimination for my gender. And then I wrote, so everybody had a little story to tell about that as well, some more than others.
Yes. And especially with Victor,
Yeah.
because hopefully I don't get in trouble with this, but being a gay man when it was okay to be gay in the military and still go through what he went through
Oh, it was
because he
worse. Once
did.
once Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, it actually was worse for him in the military.
Yes.
Yeah. There's two LGBTQ people in the book. One is an active duty airman who I didn't reveal her name, right?
Right. Hmm.
And she's a Latina as well. So I didn't reveal any, who she is, but I told her story as a gay woman, right? Not only did she get the gender stuff, but and she said that people would talk about her sex life in the office like it was important, like it made a difference. You know, she just wanted to be evaluated on her merit and what she contributed to the mission, right? But they're
Mm-hmm.
talking about her sex life, you know. So yeah, the culture of the military, you know, I love the military. You know, people think, you know, I wrote a book like this, I'm going to be bashing the military. I just want the rules, policies, and laws to change to protect everyone, not just some, right? And
Right.
it was my
Mm-hmm.
honor to serve this country. My father served, my brother served. You know, we're a military family. So I would serve again. You know, but I want to create transformational change, and by telling these stories, I'm hoping I'm adding to the national dialogue.
I think you are. And I know you're definitely getting noticed for this. And then Harry just added another comment here. The intersectionality of your stories is deep.
Right. Yeah,
Yes.
that was, I knew it was gonna be important, but I had no idea how significant that was gonna be to a Black woman. You know, and a lot of us talked about it. And I think in one, I actually wrote her what she said. She said, most of the time I did, she was a Black woman in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time I did not know if I was being discriminated against, treated poorly because I was a woman or because I was a Black woman. You know, so there were times when they weren't sure. You know, but I can tell you as a Latina and a woman that the gender issues were much more pronounced for me than the ethnicity. But my skin is not as dark. You know what I'm saying? It's darker, but not
Mm-hmm.
dark. So I think that has something to do with it too. So, but able to share those stories of African American, Latino, and um, and LGBTQ and the women in the book, I think that that's important because again, you have no idea what the person serving next to you has gone through.
That's right.
And I say this a lot when I'm in, because we are not a monolith. Veterans are not a monolith. We, you know, we share a common bond, we share common experiences, but we are different. My experience in the military and yours, Tim, were totally different, right?
That's right.
How I
Mm-hmm.
was viewed, how I was treated, you know, was totally different from yours, right? So we just have to remember that and then respect that, and then we just move on, you know. I think so many people don't even acknowledge that there are differences like that. You know, your
Right.
experience as a white man would be totally different from mine. You know,
Oh,
so,
I saw it in my own shop that I worked in.
yeah,
People were
yeah,
definitely treated different because of the color of their skin or their
yeah,
gender.
yeah,
And also, I know for my brothers and I had three brothers that served in the Air Force, and then me, and then our sister was thinking about joining the military, and the four of us were like, "No way, nope, not happening." And she's like, "Why?" I said, "Because you're going to be treated like shit when you do get in." And
yeah.
she says, "What are you talking about?" I says, "Women do not get treated well."
You know, my dad didn't talk to me about that. My dad was enlisted. He was at E7
Mm-hmm.
when he retired, and he was in the Navy and the Air Force. And he didn't tell me that, but he told me that if I'm going to come in, I need to come in as an officer. You know, I think
Mm-hmm.
he thought that I would have some insulation as an officer
Right.
from some of that, because he didn't tell me this stuff, but he kind of hinted that I would be better off if I came as an officer just from that. I think the insulation he thought would be, um, but you know, my first assignment was a fighter squadron, and women, you know, weren't authorized to be fighter pilots back then. So it was a
Mm-hmm.
truly hyper masculine unit. And I got the luck of the draw. I mean, that's my first assignment. You know, I talked to other women who came in the military. They didn't have the experiences like I did on their first assignment because they weren't sent to such deeply rooted, entrenched, toxic masculinity organizations, right? So,
Right.
yeah,
But I'm glad we had that talk with our sister because, man, yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
because we
I am the first woman in my family to join the military and the first officer in the family. And I hate to say this, but I think it's probably stopping with my generation. You know, because of some of the
mm-hmm.
stuff that happened and just for example, my son, you know, he doesn't want to move as much as I did. You know, he doesn't want to make those type of sacrifices. You know, because
Yep.
you know, mommy wasn't home a lot. You know,
Yeah.
so and that's hard on a family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you started contacting people to see if they'd tell you their story, were there any people that said no?
Yeah, well, some people said, "No, it's just I'm not ready to go public. I just can't do it." And then some
Mm-hmm.
people said, "I'm going to tell you my story, but you can't publish it." and their stories were horrific, and I understand totally why they didn't want to go public, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it just it it's just so sad, you know. But yeah, I know everybody will come to this on their own if they ever feel like, okay, I can tell my story publicly, because it is very hard to do that. So I say that's fine. I mean, like I told you, I had plenty of people that I could have written a lot more stories. So I interviewed more people, and I did not include their stories because at the end of the day, they just didn't feel comfortable. Their family had no idea what they went through. My family had no idea. My
Hmm.
brothers and sister, they had no idea at all what I went through. My ex-husband had no idea. I mean, I literally buried it for years, you know. But it comes out in different ways, you know, and PTSD through chronic insomnia, maybe chronic pain, migraines. I mean, it
Hmm.
comes out in different ways. So, you know, if I knew then what I know now, I would have probably tried to get a better handle on it. But it was too hard because in the military for me, that's a sign of weakness back then, right?
Right.
Nowadays, we're trying to destigmatize asking for help, getting help. And I am trying to
Hmm.
do that as well because to me, it's been a sign of empowerment. It's really helped me being so vulnerable, you know?
And that leads me right into my next question. Were there any of the people that you interviewed when they were all done with this asking where they can go get help?
Um, some were already getting help, some refused to.
Hmm.
Everybody, I talk about that in every chapter. Like, what coping mechanisms did you use? What helped you kind of go through this? What are you doing now? So I try to include their journey of resilience and also
Hmm.
empowerment, because a lot of them had kind of made it through the dark side into the light, and they were doing wonderful things with their life, right? And I wanted to show that because, you know, we're not all broken people, you know, huddled up in the corner, you know. We've gone through these traumatic experiences, but we've gotten help. Um, and so some of them said they would consider maybe, because I try to talk about the VA in a positive way because I had a positive experience. But my first two experiences with the VA were not positive at all when it comes to seeing a psychologist. Um,
Hmm.
but the third one was a charm, right? But I think it was because I was also ready to talk. But the first two, I was not ready to talk. Um, so I don't. What was interesting too is we shared stories of how what worked for us, and one of them was a sailor, and when I even her, she told me about a book, and she became a licensed counselor, and she told me about a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and by a
Okay.
physician. And oh my goodness. And so I'm interviewing her, and then she says, Lisa, you need to get this book. And I'm like, okay. So she was like probably the third, fourth person I interviewed. I bought that book, I read it, and oh my goodness, I learned so much. That's an outstanding book, directly ties traumatic experience to therapy, getting better. There's a whole chapter on EMDR, and that's when I decided to do EMDR when I read that chapter. It was so enlightening. I could connect the dots with some of my medical conditions, a service connected that I had to my initial assault, where before I had no idea, right? So I encourage anybody and everybody to read that book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's a great book.
I'm gonna have to check that out too. And Harry again has another comment, and I like this comment too. You own your story, but you are not defined by your trauma.
Right. No longer.
Yep.
You know, I think at one point I was because I was afraid to speak up, right?
Hmm.
But no longer. I own what happened to me. I didn't ask for it to happen to me, but it did. But I own it. I've been able to process it as much as I could. I mean, I will never forget what I went through, but I can now speak to you somewhat articulately about
Hmm.
what I've gone through, and I wrote about it, of course. But when I
Hmm.
first started writing, I mean, I couldn't. I remember doing excerpts of the book at different events, and I would, you know, the author stands up there and reads, right? I remember crying during some of the stuff because I just couldn't. It was just so hard for me to stand there and publicly admit that this happened to me, or that I have PTSD, and that, you know, combat affected me more than I ever cared to say. I mean, it was really hard to do that.
Right.
But again, so empowering for me. But that
Hmm.
might not work for everybody. You know, I had
Right.
the honor of speaking to some incarcerated vets, you know,
Mm.
and talking to them about how to use the arts to help heal. You know, for me, poetry, writing is what helps me. But I partnered with somebody on my second book, another combat vet, another woman, and she illustrated all the poems in my second book. And I think that's great because we both have learned to use our artistic abilities for healing. And you know, people say, "Oh, that's hokey." No, it works. For us, it worked. Now, for someone else, it may be ceramic making or something, it
Right.
may be woodworking, it may be metal, and maybe just do something mindful with your hands and your body, and you just, do it. And it's amazing how some of the arts therapy is real.
Yes. Because I remember um, about 20 years ago, I'm sitting at home, lost, not knowing what to do. I know something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I picked up a newspaper ad and had a camera for sale. And I says, that's something I used to do. I don't do it anymore. So I went and I bought that camera and got back into photography, led me back in doing paintings again. And it helps. It
Yeah,
actually helps. If I
yeah,
get frustrated, I put a canvas out in the backyard and just sling paint at it.
yeah, yeah. It's important
Sometimes
you find what works
something
for
comes out.
you,
Yeah.
and for all of us, it's different, something different, but a healthy
Yes.
outlet. I
That's right.
mean, I think a lot of us go through a phase where, we drink too much or whatever,
Yep.
and we take pills or whatever, that typically doesn't solve the problem, right?
No, it just
So,
adds to it actually.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
so I
It
think it's
covers it up.
important, but it's important to be honest about that, and
Hmm.
again, I wrote about that in the second book. I was pretty honest about kind of my healing journey, and yeah, so
Oh yeah, I remember those heavy drinking days. Whew, thank God I gave it up.
right.
I but one of the things that I read about in your book is several of these people also had severe, not severe, but yeah, I would say severe suicidal and thoughts. And did they uh, relate to you in any way about what made them not commit suicide?
Uh, yes, and several of them did attempt suicide, and I talk about it in the book. I was able to share that too. I mean, the desperation they must have felt, at that low point in their life,
Hmm.
Um, but typically, it was the intervention of somebody else. An intervention of a phone call could be another, at the time, active duty member that called to check on them. Just, hey, how you doing? And that's all it took to stop them from proceeding to what they were doing, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's important. That buddy check thing, that's real.
Yes.
We need to check on each other because again, you have no
Yep.
idea the depth of trauma someone might be carrying, or how really low they might be. So I think it's when you have friends and you have a network, check on them. And because something as simple as a phone call saved someone's life in that I wrote about. You know,
That's right.
just to check on them. And what has happened too is when I finished the book right before it got published, one of the individuals did try to commit suicide, and I was just devastated because here I just interviewed all these people and I interviewed this person, and I won't say who it is, but I felt like, man, did I not see that coming? Right? Could I have done
Hmm.
something? Right? um, and that person had reached out to me like a day before, you know. So that was hard for me to take because I felt like, what could I have done differently? Could I have, been there better for them, been stronger, that kind of thing for them? um, but it all worked out because it really wasn't a suicide attempt, it was a cry for help.
Hmm.
And they got the help they need. They had been misdiagnosed for years, so they got a proper diagnosis, the proper medication, and now is doing wonderful things, right, with their life, both personally and professionally. So I feel good about that. But it scared me for a while there because I'm like,
Hmm.
wow, the book's not yet published. Do I go back and add this, or do I just leave it alone? And then I felt a little guilt from the way maybe I didn't respond to the individual when they reached out. I responded, but maybe not in the way they needed, right?
Right.
So, and that's the old commander thing again,
Hmm.
um, and you need to check on your people. I agree
Yes.
with Harry on that. You have to check on your people, and don't assume that everything's fine. And sometimes you have to be the invasive person that asks 50 questions,
Yes.
right? And then
Hmm.
they get mad at you and they push you away. But deep down, they're probably very happy, and uh, it makes them feel good that you actually care, But you got to be sincere. The fake
Hmm.
stuff ain't going to work. You got to
No.
really be sincere, and they know it. They can sift through all that BS. So
Oh yes.
if that's who you are, you really do care about people, and you check on them, then they will know that. they will know that you care for them. And all it takes is one person. I had a person reach out to me through a direct messaging, and he had posted something online that said that, that he was a burden to his family, and I knew he had suffered from MST. So he's not in the book. He was somebody else. I've had so many people come to me and tell me their stories, right? So this is, excuse me, another gentleman, and this was like at midnight. I immediately responded online to him and said, hold up, you are not a burden to your family. Let's talk about this, right? And then he came back to me, and
Mhm.
then I said, do you remember what you told me when you read one of the stories in my book? How important it really hit you, and it made you feel like you were worthy, and that what happened to you, you can turn that and you can tell your own story and help other people because this story in this book helped you. He said, yes, I remember. I said, okay. And then he comes back to me later that night, probably 1 in the morning, saying, thank you, Colonel, for reminding me I still have a mission.
Yes,
And sometimes that's all it takes.
that's right.
What if I was sound asleep, didn't respond or whatever? Yeah, I don't know. So,
Hmm.
and I've had people tell me, I can't believe you took my call. I had a homeless woman vet call me, and she had experienced MST. And she told me she had not spoken up about her experiences until she read some of my poetry. And then now she's getting help. And she called me and said, you told me I could call you. I said, yeah. She said, I can't believe you took my call. And I've said, yeah, of course I'm going to take your call. I know what this is like. So how can I help you? And she was,
Hmm.
for the first time in her life, she was going to submit a VA claim. So
Oh
I
man,
did a I, I
fantastic.
did a I did a warm handoff with her and somebody in another agency that could help her, and that, you know, several months later, she's 100% now, and she's getting the care she needs, and she's no longer homeless, and that's what it's all about,
That's
right?
right. That's
Yeah.
right. And through your journey, is there one particular highlight that always sticks out for you?
In what regard? I mean, that's a
Um,
really broad question.
yeah, that is kind of broad. Um, okay, let's narrow it down to dealing with people.
Well, I would just say that
Um,
story I just told, the homeless woman vet. I mean, when I first
yeah.
met her, I knew that what I was writing was changing people's lives. I mean, this is a woman who I was at an event and I was sharing some of my poetry, right? And my first book had already been published. And she opens the door into the event and she says, "Where is she? Where is she?" And then someone points me out. She goes, "Oh, is that her?" And then she runs across the room. And this woman, I don't know her. She grabs
Mhm.
me, hugs me, and lifts me up. And then she starts
Mhm.
crying and tells me I saved her life. And I'm like, I mean, talk
Oh
about
man,
humbling experience, right? And then
yes.
she's told me that her counselor, I share a lot of my work, especially my poetry, with VA counselors to
Mm.
help them get an insight into the mind of who traumatic people, I guess, right? And I've been told by physicians that, hey, you really gave us insight, and now we know better. We can do more informed care because of what you just gave us, right? So she told me that her counselor shared with her one of my poems, and that now she was finally ready to talk. And I mentioned that earlier, talk about her experiences. And then she started sharing her experience with me. But I didn't know this woman from anybody. She was coming up to me, running. I didn't know if she was friend or foe. You know what I mean? Uh,
Mhm.
but it was an amazing, humbling experience that if I had any doubt that my writing and my work was not doing a good thing, she just killed that, you know.
Mm.
So I know that I made an impact on her life, right? And
Yes.
that happens to me more than you know. People coming up to me and telling me, "Hey, and it's a different thing. It's a different poem. It's a different piece of writing. It's a different. Or I heard you speak, and you said this that happened to me, and I just, um, it's powerful, you know.
Mm.
And again, I never thought showing such vulnerability would be so empowering. I never,
Yes.
never in a
And
million years.
I got to agree with Harry on this next comment. Your book offers people vision.
Well, I think a positive way ahead too, right?
Yes.
Is that
Hmm.
what you mean? Maybe. Yeah,
Yes. And
yeah.
how did you discover that writing was going to be a good outlet for you?
I had no idea. I mean, I have a journalism undergrad degree, and I always knew I was going to write a book. Uh, and I kept steno pads my entire career in the military, my entire career in higher ed, because I was going to write a book of my life. I was going to write a book on leadership. I always thought my first book would be about leadership.
Mm.
Boy, was I wrong. I had no idea my first book was going to be about military sexual trauma. If you had told me that even 5 years ago, I would have said, nope, that ain't going to happen, you know? Um,
Hmm.
but it changed my life. And and I'm also going to say something and be very vulnerable, but I'm a Christian woman. And I believe that the good Lord put me on this path because I would never speak up publicly about this kind of personal traumatic experience. And ever since I started writing about it, um, people like this woman I told you came up to me.
Hmm.
Other people, doors are opening like crazy. It's like I'm on this path for a reason. When I left
Yep.
Iraq, I used to question why I'm alive because so many young people died, and I didn't. Why am I still alive? You know. And so I went through the whole survivor's guilt thing too, and I think this is it. It's to help other people tell these stories, share their stories, and yeah. So I think that that's part of why I'm still around. Also to be
Well,
here for my family and my grandchildren, of course. But
yes. But I'm definitely glad you're around because you are definitely making an impact on people's lives for the better. For the
yeah,
better.
and I'm proud of both my books. The first one did win an award from the Military Writers Society of America, so I'm great. The one about MST. And
Hmm.
then the next one was a memoir, kind of unusual, poems, prose, and art. But it tells a journey, and it tells a journey about growing up as a Latina. It's in Spanglish, Spanish, and English, and I think that's important too because that book is truly an authentic version of who I am. And when I talk about this one poem called Cocktail, it's not about liquor. It's about the cocktail of pills the military put me on to help me with PTSD and nightmares and all that kind of stuff. So I write about how
Hmm.
these this cocktail of pills were like a godsend, and then they became a crutch. And then I had to work hard to get off of them, right? So
Yep.
when I was at the prison talking to incarcerated vets, they asked me, "Do you have anything on addiction?" I said, "Let me read you this poem," because it took me a while to get off of that, right?
Right.
Um, and so I can see how my fellow vets can easily slip into the world of addiction, the world of alcoholism, because these are all ways that they're trying to cope with their experience, but they're not positive ways, and they're not for the long run. So that's why I talk about, yeah, I went through that too. This is what happened to me, and then hopefully it will give them inspiration to pick more healthy methods of moving forward. Yeah.
Now, you did mention both books, so let me bring these up. All right, your first book is Stories from the Front: Pain, Betrayal, and Resilience on the MST Battlefield. And folks, this is what we've been talking about this entire episode. This book is definitely a book you should purchase and read. This book is absolutely amazing. The stories in this will move you to become a better human being. If it doesn't make you a better human being, you're going to help make others better. And then the second book is called Latina Warrior. And now, is that original art piece that's on the cover?
That sure is, and it's sold already. So I'm really proud of my artist collaborator. Again, she's another combat vet in the Army, another Bronze Star woman. I mean, let me tell you, there are some really strong people out there who you can collaborate with and work on for a variety of things. So I'm honored that she accepted my offer to collaborate with me. So she created 50 pieces of original art for every poem in the book.
Now, I got to admit, Harry is a friend of mine, and he's a huge supporter. And he did mention about my art a little bit earlier, but we're not going to post what he said. But Harry, you see this?
This is a collage piece, and everything you see, like there's the sunglasses have patches. Those are original patches that I had from one was Strategic Command, one was a fighter squadron I was at. Those are original medals, and the fabric. I wanted this book to have the juxtaposition between a Latina
Mm-hmm.
and a warrior.
Yes.
That was important to me to tell my story because this is the first time I've really been authentic with how what I'm doing. So all these pieces that you see are pieces of my life that I sent her because she lived in a completely different state in the Midwest. So I sent her a box full of stuff, and then she created this fantastic art piece. And you see it. I mean, you can clearly see what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we were just so honored that it sold on the first book launch event. So. And
And
I have to say, we're selling prints of this if people are interested. We're selling now, I just got the trademark approved for Latino Warrior. So I'll be selling more shirts and different things.
There you go.
Yeah, it's really cool. I'm excited to partner with a woman, Army vet, who has her own sock company because I'm going to come up with Latina Warrior socks. So it's kind of exciting.
Man, you're giving me some ideas.
Yeah, let me tell you, my problem is I have too many ideas, Tim, and I got to stop because I only want to work part-time now. So I want to spend
There
more
you
time
go.
with my family and my grandchildren. So I've been
Well,
pretty good about it this year, but I start a new book next year. Um, my next book will be about veterans who are entrepreneurs.
there you go. Awesome. And here he says, "Congrats on your mark."
Yeah, that is a long process. I don't know if you all have
Hmm.
ever done that, but it took like 16 months to get a provisional approval, and now I have to generate some sales till I get the final approval. And I'm trying to partner with small businesses, especially other veteran-owned business, to do the apparel and stuff.
There you go. That's something my nonprofit's going to have to look into here soon. Is apparel,
Yeah.
and but Harry, what do you think? Should I trademark the Gulf War Advocate? When I was advocating for the PACT Act, I met Senator John Tester from Montana, and he was heading up the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate. And my first trip to Washington, D.C. was to attend the first hearing on the PACT Act in the Senate. And he couldn't remember my name, but he remembered that I was the only Gulf War veteran that was advocating for the PACT Act.
Hmm.
So that's how I got that. And I've been using it ever since.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your advocacy in that area. I mean, I had a medical condition that was denied by the VA, but
Mm-hmm.
the PACT Act, that was one of the presumptive conditions. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I want to thank you for coming on. And I want all our viewers to know that your website, lisacarringtonfirmin.com. It's a very easy to use, very user friendly website. You can purchase her books on there. You can see some of her art, read some of her poetry, learn more about Lisa herself on there. And if I'm correct, you can also book speaking engagements, correct?
Yes, I do several keynotes around the country. I just did George Washington University's keynote for Veterans Day. That was my honor to do that. So I do a lot of speaking engagements across a variety of areas. So sure, I would be happy to do that. Just people to reach out to me on my website. There's a place for you to send a contact on my website.
All right. All right. Once again, people, it's lisacarringtonfirmin.com. And both books are called Latina Warrior and Stories from the Front, Pain, Betrayal, and Resilience on the MST Battlefield. I have to look over to the side where I got the book. The print on the
Yeah.
screen's a little bit too small for me.
Well, yeah, and the subtitle's kind of long, but those words, I fell on my sword on those words with my publisher: pain, betrayal, and resilience, because I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
convey the messaging behind that in every story. That's important to me. So,
And then Harry's thanking us both.
oh, great. Well, thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate that, Harry.
Yes, Harry. Thank
So
you.
now I want to go see some of your art, Tim. So where's your art?
Oh, I don't have the website anymore. I'm gonna have to redo it. But one of my pieces was called 22, and it was accepted into last year's Ohio Veterans Art Exhibit that they held at the State
Great.
House in Columbus.
Very nice. Very
So
nice. Yeah.
got a lot
Are
of
you
comments
familiar with
about it.
Uniting Us?
What's that?
Are you familiar with Uniting Us? It's a group of veteran
No.
artists across the country. You
Hmm.
should check that out because you'd be a great addition to them as an artist. I'm a member of that organization with the writing I do and the poetry I do, and then my artist collaborator, she's a member of it as well. So, and we do. That's how I met her. Uniting Us brought us to DC at the Women's Military Memorial. We did an event. We did an event at Library of Congress. We show kind of how we use the arts to help us heal and just what we can do as vets. So I think it's important that we amplify each other's efforts.
Yes,
So I would ask you to check that out, or I can send you
I will.
information on it later.
Yeah, yeah. Go
And
ahead
then
and
I'm
do
going to
that.
put a plug in for my next book. I
Mm-hmm.
told you about veteran
Yes,
entrepreneurs. Maybe next year you can have me on while I'm in the middle of writing that.
yes. Oh, yes. I definitely want to have you back on.
Yeah.
I this has been a true honor for me to have you on as a guest, And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on. I know this is going to reach a lot of people. I know we're going to get a lot of feedback on this, a lot of positive feedback.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a difficult
Oh,
subject, but I've learned that we have to have these courageous conversations, right?
yes.
We have to. We want to move forward and keep everybody safe in the military. We need to do this.
And to our fellow veterans out there, you've heard me mention this before. You're going to hear me mention it again. When we separated, we became a member of the biggest fraternity in this country, and it's called Veterans of the United States of America. We have an obligation to look after each other, check up on each other, speak up for each other. As Lisa stated in this book, and one of the chapters in here, one of the ladies even stated, you got to use your voice. All right. Not sure who our guest is next week, folks. I believe it's going to be an individual from Texas. It's going to discuss Texas legislation for veterans that's in the state house down there. And we'll see you all next week. And if you could stay on just for a moment, Lisa,
Sure. Thank you
we'll
again.
be, yep, you're very welcome.